King Lear late at night on the cliffs asks the blind Earl of Gloucester, "How do you see the world?" And the blind man Gloucester replies, "I see it feelingly." And shouldn't we all? Rudyard Kipling, also from India, wrote that of young men dying in World War I. And if they ask you why we died, tell them that our fathers lied. That legacy of lies continues today. What we all think we know about certain industries, the meat and dairy industry in particular, is a preposterous lie. You see, the world is crying out today for only two things: leadership and the truth. Right now, I'm just going to tell you the truth. The wise Chinese have a word for it: Zhengjiao. Listen to the friend who tells you the truth, even when it hurts. So let's just tell the truth fearlessly and forcefully. That is what the Sanskrit word satyagraha means, the truth force. Now, Brendan Kennelly in the book of Judas wrote, "If you want to serve your age, betray it." But what does that mean, to betray your age? It means expose its lies, humiliate its conceits, debunk its arrogance, and condemn them to face harsher truths. There was a time when my favorite food was filet mignon and lobster, a fact for which I am so profoundly ashamed today. So what made me as a young man decide to leave the world of lobsters and Learjets in exchange for shelters and slaughterhouses? To take nothing but pictures, own nothing but memories, leave nothing but footprints, kill nothing but time. Well, you see, something happened to me. I had been to Dante's Inferno, but unlike Dante Alighieri, I didn't have Beatrice for my love or Virgil for my guide. I heard the screams of my dying father as his body was ravaged by the many cancers that killed him. And I realized I'd heard those screams before. In the slaughterhouse, on the cattle ships to the Middle East, and a dying mother whale as a harpoon explodes in her brain as she calls out to her calf. Their cries were the cries of my father. They were identical. And I discovered that when we suffer as equals. And in their capacity to suffer, a dog is a pig, is a bear, is a boy. So when I look into your faces today, I'm reminded of the words of the Greek poet Horace: "Change only the name, and my story is also about you." Now, in human history, only 100 billion human beings ever lived. 7.5 billion human beings are alive today. And we humans torture and kill 2 billion sentient, living, loving animals every week. 2 billion. We stab and suffocate 1 billion ocean animals every 8 hours. If human beings were killed at the same rate, we'd be wiped out in one weekend. Trillions of fish are ground up into pellets to feed to livestock. Vegetarian cows are now the world's largest ocean predators. You see, the oceans are dying in our time. By 2048, all our fisheries will be dead, the lungs and the arteries of the earth. Now, you would all know that oceans sequester more CO2 than all the forests of the world put together. 10,000 entire species wiped out every year because of the actions of one species. And we now face the 6th mass extinction in cosmological history. If any of my algorithms are correct, and they all are, it means that no child under the age of 5 will ever reach retirement age. If that does not chill your blood. If any other organism had done this, a biologist would call it a virus. It is a crime of unimaginable proportions. Now, Victor Hugo said there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. But I say there is nothing more destructive than a bad idea whose time has passed. The time for meat, I hate to tell you, has passed. But happily, as I see it, the world is changing. 20 years ago, Twitter was a bird sound. www was a stuck keyboard. Cloud was in the sky. Skype was a typo. 3G was a parking space. Google was a baby's burp. And Al-Qaeda was my plumber. Now, the most beautiful word ever written at any time, in any language, in any country in human history, came from India, from the Upanishads 3,000 years ago. Ahimsa, non-violence to any living being. You see, the things that I'm talking about are not just about animal rights. They're actually also about human wrongs. But animal rights is now the greatest social justice issue since the abolition of slavery. It is a revolutionary event, more powerful than the Industrial Revolution, the Reformation, the Hubble telescope, or anything ever conceived by Galileo, Copernicus, Einstein, Darwin, or Freud. Because it protects the most precious of all things, life. People like that are creating the new enlightenment, the second Renaissance. So all my projects that we have today, we assemble them in silos. We call them Kindness Kids, Kindness Farms, Kindness Oceans, Kindness Skies, Kindness Streets, Kindness Mobile Restaurants, Kindness House, and the Kindness Gold Medal and Cash Prize every year. And our 5 fingers cover children, animals, the environment, the terminally ill, and aspiring youth. And what do? We fund things like provide money, we provide advice, and we provide encouragement for schools, hospitals, orphanages, clinics, shelters, sanctuaries, ambulances, ships, helicopters, bore wells, biogas plants, medicines, feeding programs, disaster relief, and of course you all know my involvement with Sea Shepherd. We've already sunk half the Norwegian whaling fleet and half the Icelandic whaling fleet, so we're anti-poaching, for anti-whaling, anti-factory farming, the fur industry, and of course vivisection of animals in laboratories. So when people ask me what I am, I say I'm a venture capitalist for good causes. And I really love leverage. Now you all know what leverage is on your balance sheet, I'm sure. Some of you know more about it than you'd like to know. Let's just consider a bank, for example, with a debt equity ratio of 25:1. That's pretty typical. For every $1 in equity or shareholders' funds or share capital and reserves, they have $25 worth of debt sitting on the balance sheet. And the banks say it has a 3% margin on its corporate book. And without gapping its treasury money market operations, it will achieve a return on equity of 18%. And if you distributed half your net profit after tax, you would still have an earnings per share growth of 15%, like clockwork. You don't need a PhD in financial maths to understand it. It's real simple. You can do it on a piece of paper. Mathematically simple. And that's how banks work. Banks do 3 things. They borrow money, they lend money, they collect money. Everything else is just window dressing. I have to tell you, banking was a good business. I was the vice president of Citibank and running the mergers and acquisitions business for many years. It was a really good business. When it was good, it was very, very good. And when it was bad, it was still quite good. So the algorithms that pop in my head without me even thinking go something along these lines. If I could invest X million dollars to influence Y% of a target audience of 7 billion people, how many trillion lives will be saved? How many million gigaliters of water or millions of hectares of old-growth forests? How many millions of new jobs? How many gigatons of ocean debris? How many parts per million of greenhouse gas emissions? How many millions added to GDP? And how many years additionally for human survival? And we can talk about that in Q&A, because I have a very apocalyptic view of the future. So let's just talk about one example of leverage. Let's talk about Kindness House that some of the Thai guys and Saurabh knows about. We're in a building, 40,000 square feet here in Melbourne, worth about $15 million. And what we did was bring about 300 very smart, young, energetic, brilliant people into the building rent-free, serviced offices from 45 different NGOs, Sea Shepherd, Greenpeace, the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, social firms, Lawyers for Animals, you name it, we've got them. And we paid all their operating costs, rates, taxes, insurance, cleaning, air conditioning, heating, security, repairs, maintenance, high-speed internet, gave them showers, offices, boardrooms, training rooms, kitchens, movie theater, everything they could possibly like. Money, advice, counseling, and encouragement. And all these little organizations that we took off the kitchen table and brought them into Kindness House grew massively. Tiny organizations that didn't have enough money to pay their telephone bill raised well over $100 million. And how many millions of lives have they saved in the process? Now that is leverage. And we can talk about leverage, how much money we invest in the southern oceans and Antarctica to fight the Japanese and other people. But you get the general picture. We don't use the metrics of return on equity or return on assets. We look at the metric of how many lives will we save in the shortest period of time with the maximum amount of impact, and how scalable is it so other people can take it on. And some of I was just telling, I think was it Vivek, I was telling someone earlier today, India turns out to be the jewel in the crown, because we got 55 projects there. And if you only knew about some of them, it would blow your mind. We got the best people on the planet working in our projects there. Now, the great anthropologist Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a few committed people can change the world. Indeed, that is the only thing that ever has. Well, there are only 13 million Jews in the world, yet they play such a vibrant role in international affairs. Look at the number of Nobel Prizes they win every single year like clockwork. Now, Trix and I sat in the stadium at the Olympics, full of pride as Australia won more medals than every country in the world with the exception of Russia and the United States. Tibet's population is only 3 million. But who hasn't heard of the plight of the Tibetan? But there are over 600 million vegetarians and vegans in the world. 600 million. And most of them are Indian. Now that is bigger than the United States, England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, all put together. If they were one nation, they would be bigger than the 27 nations of the European Union. And despite this massive demographic footprint, they are still drowned out by the raucous hunt and shoot and kill and cretins who believe that violence is the answer when it should not even be a question. So these are some of the things that we need to get our heads around. Forest depletion caused by the meat and dairy industry costs 3 times as much as the recent global financial crisis, and it happens every year. Zoonotic diseases from factory farms now threaten a pandemic to rival the Black Death, which wiped out half of Europe. The World Bank says that one influenza pandemic will cost the global economy $3 trillion. And meat and dairy is killing us with cancers, heart disease, osteoporosis, and diabetes. The great Indian Dr. Kasliwal in the UK wrote in The Lancet that India will soon account for 70% of the world's cardiovascular disease due to their preposterous addiction to dairy. I'm sorry to say it, but these are the facts. And he said it'll happen in the future. It happened 2 years ago. And Medicare and bad diets have already crippled and bankrupted the United States because of their heavy addiction to meat and dairy. They would need $8 trillion invested in treasury bills just to pay the interest. And they got precisely 0. Laddus. They could shut down every school, university, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Homeland Security, FBI and CIA, and they still will not have enough free cash flow to service their Medicare debt. Isn't that a frightening scenario? And Australia is just the same. So how big is $8 trillion? It's a big number, I know. Well, that's how much the whole of Asia will need over the next 10 years for all their electricity, roads, water, telecommunications, high-speed rail right across China, ports in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, plus the new Silk Road from Central Asia to Europe. That's $8 trillion. And that's what's happening to the American economy because of their addiction to this vile product. That $8 trillion is 4 times as big as India's GDP and double the total reserves of India and China combined. Now, my TV debate on the ABC went viral. It was called Get Animals Off the Menu, and it had millions and millions of viewers, and was independently translated into over 20 languages. Oxford University calculated that if our motion was actually put into practice, it would save $30 trillion in health and environmental costs alone. $30 trillion. And antibiotics pumped into these animals, which all you guys consume, causes antimicrobial resistance in humans. And that will kill 10 million people per annum by 2050 and cost the global economy $100 trillion. So if you thought 8 trillion was a big number, what do you think about 100 trillion? Now that is 60 times what the whole world spends on aircraft carriers, missiles, bombs, bullets, drones, destroyers, tanks, mines, guns, and spies. That's $100 trillion. Now, you would know now that water is the new oil. Nations will soon be going to war over it. We've spent a lot of time in many countries, in Africa, South America, India, Europe, the United States. We recently gave a speech in the Knesset and in the Israeli parliament, a speech in the parliament in The Hague, and we deliver exactly the same message. Water is a key issue. Underground aquifers that took millions of years to fill are now running dry. I drilled my first well when I was a teenage Boy Scout in a town called Bangalore. And we struck sweet water at 80 feet. Today we've built a very large orphanage nearby, and at 800 feet we're sucking mud. In China, at 3,000 feet, the drill head is still dry. Now you would all be outraged if 10 jumbo jets crashed every day with no survivors. Well, the same number of children die every day through water-related diseases. The mighty Colorado River, the Rio Grande, the Indus, and the Yellow Rivers frequently no longer reach the sea, sucked dry by the meat and dairy industry, whilst 4 billion people suffer from water scarcity. So why do I speak to you about water? Because it takes 50,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of beef, 1 swimming pool. It takes 1,000 liters of water to produce 1 liter of milk, and a dairy farmer makes 28 cents a liter for it. What a preposterously stupid industry. In any sane world, Barnaby Joyce would be put in prison. 1 billion people today are hungry. 20 million people will die this year from malnutrition. Cutting meat by only 10% will feed 100 million people, and going vegan ends malnutrition forever. And food prices are skyrocketing. It used to cost me for Thai rice for Southeast Asian projects 197 US dollars a ton. And it then went up to $1,015 a ton. A 5-fold increase in 5 months. And we've discovered that poor countries are now selling their grain to the West for hard currency, whilst their own children starve in their arms, and the West feeds it to livestock. So we can eat a steak? I bet I'm not the only one in this room who sees that as a crime. Believe me, every morsel of meat we eat is slapping the tear-stained face of a hungry child. When I look into her eyes, do I remain silent? If everyone ate a Western diet, we would need 2 planet Earths to feed us. We've only got 1, and she is dying. The Earth can produce enough food for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And greenhouse pollution nowadays from livestock vastly exceeds that of transport. Cars, trains, buses, ships, lorries, bikes, the whole kit and caboodle. And the melting Siberian permafrost is now a ticking time bomb. When it releases its sequestered gas, the game is over. I recommend everyone go to Russia and see the Yamal Peninsula. It'll terrify you. And the Himalayan ice fields are correctly called the third pole, because those ice fields feed half the world's population through the Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, and the Yellow Rivers. And these glaciers are melting fast. I presented these numbers in a speech to 2,000 wealthy Thai members in New Delhi, including Amartya Sen, who was sitting in the front row, and he'd just got India's Nobel Prize in Economics. And I mentioned to Muhammad Yunus after he won the Nobel that all the good that he had done with Grameen Bank would vanish when Bangladesh drowns, to say nothing about Manila, Mumbai, Calcutta, Ho Chi Minh City, and Bangkok. And then Trix and I had dinner with Al Gore, and we discussed the same number. And more recently, I gave a speech here in Melbourne to Jeff Shedd with Dr. Peter Doherty, who won Australia's Nobel Prize in medicine. No arguments at all from 4 Nobel laureates, but lots of arguments from the grubby, ignoble meat and dairy lobby. So Upton Sinclair was right. It is impossible to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And I spoke to Admiral Denny McGinn, who's the chief of US warfighting requirements, and he said, Phil, we have learned that nations will raid and invade long before they starve. And we freak out here in Australia when 1,000 poor refugees arrive on our shores. Just imagine greenhouse gas emissions hitting 500 parts per million, or a 3-degree temperature rise, creating 100 million eco-refugees in our theatre alone. This calamity will reshape the geopolitical landscape forever. We are facing the perfect storm. Any nation that developed weapons that could wreak such havoc on the planet, we would launch a preemptive military strike and bomb it back into the Bronze Age. But we can't, because it is not a rogue state. It's an industry. The good news is we don't have to bomb it. We can just stop buying it. But George Bush was wrong. The axis of evil doesn't run through Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. It runs through our dining tables. Weapons of mass destruction are our knives and forks, and increasingly our chopsticks. You see, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. This disgusting industry will end because we run out of excuses. And farmers are the ones with the most to gain. Farming won't end, it would boom. Only the product line would change. Farmers would make so much money they wouldn't even bother counting it, and I'd be the first to applaud them. Believe me, veganism is the engine of redirected economic growth. Governments would love us. New industries would emerge and flourish. Health insurance premiums would plummet. Hospital waiting lists would disappear. Hell, we'd be so healthy, we'd have to shoot someone just to start a cemetery. I must tell you that last week, the American Medical Association called for all meat products to be banned in hospitals, and the World Health Organization now strongly recommends people drop meat and dairy from their diet and go vegan. And last year, 40 investors with $2 trillion in assets called on global food companies to replace all animal protein with plant protein. And plant-based food industry numbers are as follows. It contributes in the United States alone $14 billion per annum to the US economy. This is plant-based, huh? Only plant-based. It's created more than 60,000 jobs in 1 year, pays its workers $13,000 more than the average US salary, paid $1.1 billion in tax, produces 10 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions than beef, and gets 0 subsidies. If I was a young man and wanted to be a billionaire, I know exactly which industry I want to be in. And finally, this thing gives us the peace dividend. I addressed the World Parliament of Religions, and I said that the peace map is drawn on a menu. Peace is not just the absence of war. It is the presence of justice. So talking about peace while still killing animals is like loving literature and burning books. They are mutually exclusive ideas. Justice must be blind to race, color, religion, and to species. If she's not blind, she will be used as a weapon of terror. And there's incredible terror in those ghastly gulags we call slaughterhouses and factory farms. So, in my journey through Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I've learned that a man is measured not by how much money he makes, but by how much of it he's willing to give away, particularly to strangers. And if you wish to increase a man's share of happiness, do not aim to increase his possessions. Simply decrease his desires. So Socrates and Epicurus were right. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's not a life, it's a life sentence. And I know I didn't find my character on Wall Street because it lives on the road to Damascus. And finally, that my heart does resonate to the words of W.H. Auden. If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. The last sentence of Scott Brachel's book, The Great Gatsby, reads, So we beat on, boats against the tide, drawn back ceaselessly into the past. I ask you, are we to live forever in a sick, smug and cruel past? Let's not relive history. Let's make history, because that is what leaders do. They make history. Judge White's closing words in The Bonfire of the Vanities were, "The law is humanity's first attempt at decency." So I ask you all to join us in the battle in a war that decency cannot afford to lose. Because in the end, only three things matter: how deeply you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things that were not meant for you. Meat was not meant for you. And I hope the world will have, one day, like Pandit Nehru said in India on my birthday in 1947, a tryst with destiny. A time when ahimsa really means something, when ahimsa is reborn. Thank you all. Jai Hind.